Welcome to week 2 of HOS 121. This lecture discusses how we study human development and the challenges and limitations to what we can know, given the research methods that are available and their strengths and weaknesses, as well as the requirements of ethical research. This lecture looks at how and why we study human development, the kinds of data that we can collect, and the research designs and methods that we use to do research, and also how to do ethical research, what kinds of principles have to be put in place. So first, how and why we study human development. Why study human development? What is the end goal? Your reading mentions 3 primary goals. One is description, to find out what happens in terms of normal or typical human development at different ages. So this kind of research answers what and how questions, what happens at certain ages, how does the developmental process unfold. It also looks at the variation in development. So, for example, it is considered well within normal for children to take their first steps as early as 9 months old or as late as 16 months old. And it's helpful to know what is typical for development to be able to identify when there are issues and delays in development that may indicate a need for early intervention. Another goal is explanation. Why does something happen in terms of development? So this answers why questions. And an example of this is what we'll look at in a later lecture this week on research on the impacts of early childhood trauma on later development and health. That research has tried to look at why certain experiences are associated with certain negative outcomes and what the mechanisms are. So, for example, with early childhood trauma, is there a mechanism where impacts on stress on the brain lead to negative outcomes? Is it through people developing coping behaviors that help them deal with negative experiences? Why does one experience lead to certain outcomes? And then another major goal, a third goal, is to optimize human development. So this is an important goal that really relies on the other 2 goals as well. Once we understand the what of development in terms of what is typical in the range of individual variation, and then the why, there's the how to maximize human potential and how to improve development. And this is often the goal of research that tests an intervention. So for example, what is the impact of high quality preschool on children's cognitive development? What is the impact of a peer support group program on elderly people's mental health? So this is the kind of research you may often interpret and conduct yourself as professionals if you work with people in fields like criminology or psychology or professions like social work. The way we study human development is through the scientific method. And your reading points out the scientific method is both an attitude and a method. In terms of an attitude, it's about being objective in the pursuit of knowledge and not being emotionally attached to an idea, but looking to whether an idea is supported by the data. And in terms of a method, it's about following a particular approach. So these are the 5 basic steps of the scientific. It starts with posing a question. So you have a research question you develop from theory, from prior research that's been done, or gaps in research, or a personal observation. Making a hypothesis based on that question, which is a prediction about what you think will hold true if you observe what you're expecting to observe, and then test the hypothesis. So design and conduct research to gather data, and then draw conclusions based on the data that you find. So does the evidence support or refute the hypothesis that you developed? And then report the results. So typically researchers report their results in peer-reviewed journal articles, so someone can have a look at their methods and see if they are legitimate, and share their data and conclusions, and also not just why that researcher thinks maybe they came up with that finding, but other reasons they may have come up with the finding. So that's the kind of overall scientific method, and we'll look at these pieces around how you design a research study and how you collect data. An initial step in doing research is to select a sample. So the idea of sample selection is to choose a representative group from a larger population that you want to draw conclusions about. So for example, I do some research about parents of children with disabilities, about how to support parents to reduce their stress. So ideally, in a research study, I would choose a random sample of parents. I would get all the members of that group, parents of children with disabilities, and be able to randomly select them into the study. And that would make it more likely that I could attribute the conclusions that I draw in my research to the population of parents with children with disabilities. But that's a very hard thing to do in research on human development. So in the example I gave, it's hard to know how do you find these parents. Maybe it's easier to communicate with parents who speak English, and so I'm missing out on a group of parents who don't have English as their first language. So often, instead of a probability sample, which is the ideal, so that you can attribute your findings back to the population, research is often done with more of a convenient sample around who researchers can access. And when that happens, when researchers use convenient samples, it's necessary to be more cautious in terms of attributing the findings about the larger population. So for example, if I only study parents of children with disabilities here in the Illawarra area from a particular service, those parents might be different from parents who use a different service or live in a different area of Australia or another part of the world. So I have to be careful in terms of what conclusions I draw. I can't say I'm speaking about all parents everywhere. After researchers decide on the population they want to be able to think about in terms of their findings and the sample of people that they have drawn and invited to participate in their study, then it's time to think about what kind of data can you collect. And so we really have three major methods of collecting data. We can ask our subjects questions, we can observe subjects, or we can conduct physiological tests on subjects. Verbal reports would probably be the most common type of collection in human development. This is interviews, these are written questionnaires, surveys, focus groups. This would be tests that children might take around cognitive development or screening instruments on children's developmental levels. So verbal reports involve asking a person about themselves or about someone else, like his or her child. It's a very common data collection method. And the advantage is that this kind of research can be used to compare individuals on particular questions or on groups of questions. So, for example, you can compare how parents rate their children's development in certain areas and compare where children are in terms of their, let's say, their physical development or their language development. But there are limitations of verbal report. You can't use it very effectively with young children because of their verbal abilities and their cognitive levels. And it's the same with adults with cognitive impairment. You can't ask them to complete a survey. So, and that's in terms of written surveys, that's also true for people with low literacy. And then there are also limitations about how people may understand and misinterpret a question, and that can relate to age differences. And also, when a researcher is asking a question to a subject, the person may be likely to give the kind of response they think is what the researcher wants. So that's the social desirability bias that's in research. So we do a lot of research with verbal reports, but it has major drawbacks. But it's a way of finding out what's going on by asking people questions. Instead of asking people in verbal self-report, you can watch people. So behavioral observations can be helpful for seeing what people actually do rather than what they say they do from a verbal self-report. And behavioral observations can be useful to find out what happens in everyday life and can also be used with young children and infants. But there are also drawbacks and limitations of observation. So it can be difficult to observe certain rare behaviors. Your reading points out it would be difficult to observe how people react in an emergency situation to help others, what motivates someone to run into a burning building and save someone. It would be really hard to set up an experiment because you'd have to be in the right place at the right time, and you wouldn't get very many cases that you could draw conclusions from. There's a lack of control over the situation with naturalistic observations, so you can't necessarily say that X leads to Y in terms of a cause and effect. You aren't controlling the exposures people have, you're more observing what happens in everyday life. And there's something called the observer effect. Just by having a person there who's present and making observations, that can influence what goes on, and that can change what would have happened if they weren't present. So people may be on their best behavior, or they may be acting more strangely or something because someone is there watching them. So I'm doing a research study right now that involves behavioral observation in a naturalistic setting. and it's about seeing how early childhood teachers interact with and support parents. And there's a researcher who's spending at the child care center observing interactions, and she spent some time there to create a sense of comfort before she started collecting data. But there are limitations, and one limitation is that people may still act differently because of her presence. But the advantage is that she can see what actually happens within a childcare setting, as opposed to if we had done a survey and asked people, asked teachers what they do, she can actually observe them. So it's a different way about learning about human behavior. And now our third type of data collection. You can ask subjects questions, you can watch subjects, or you can take physical measurements of your subjects. So you can measure body functions like brain activity, hormone levels, heart rate. The use of functional magnetic resonance imaging, the fMRI that's described in your reading, is revealing a lot about brain functioning. I haven't really used physiological measurement in my research, but I have colleagues in the Early Start Research Institute who study children's brain activity and their physical movement, and they use these kinds of data collection methods. They use things like EEGs and look at brain activity, or monitors around children's heart rates. So these methods can tell you what's really going on with someone and in their physiology, but the limitations can be a lack of clarity about what's being assessed. So if someone's showing high arousal, for example, is it the stimulus from the research causing the arousal, or is it something else, like the experience of having someone put electrodes on them or being in an fMRI machine? So it's it has, like all the other methods, it has sort of its own strengths and weaknesses. So in research studies, you have your sample and you decide what kind of data to collect. And then there's the decision about designing the study. So what should the study structure be like? A case study is an in-depth examination of a single case, which could be of an individual, could be a group of people, or could be what happens in a particular setting, like a school. Your reading talks about the baby biographies that were written by people like Charles Darwin, and he was writing case studies of his children, or one particular oldest child. So, and the study I mentioned before that involves observation within a child care center is a case study of what happens at a particular child care center. So the strengths of a case study method is that you can get really in depth and get to know what's happening with an individual or a group or a setting. It can be helpful for generating hypotheses. So for example, in my study, we might find that interacting with families in a certain way seems to help them become more knowledgeable about child development and know what to expect at different ages, and that can improve their parenting. But the limitations are you can't generalize to other people, groups and settings. So if I were trying to draw conclusions about childcare centers in general, that wouldn't really be the right way to go about it with a case study. And also with case studies, you try your best to collect different kinds of data, like observational data and interviews and documents to support your conclusions. But a lot of it depends on the interpretation of the researcher. So it can be like speculation than having hard evidence, and the more rigorous kind of evidence with different kinds of methodologies, like experimental design, which we'll talk about in a minute. The experimental method of research is a research strategy in which the researchers control the allocation of a treatment to research subjects. So you get your subjects in a study, and then you randomly assign them to a condition which manipulates or alters some aspect of their environment, and then you see how the person reacts in terms of their behavior or their development. So it's considered to be the gold standard of research, but it's often very difficult to do in human development. So it depends on the domain of human development. I know people who do research on physical development and physical fitness, and they can do random assignment of children to this intervention or no intervention. You can do that with, exposing children to certain interventions related to cognitive development, give them certain kinds of lessons or not. But for looking at social emotional development or psychosocial development, as we are in this class, it's much more difficult. We can't randomly assign people to the kinds of experiences that we're going to be looking at, like can't randomly assign someone to certain parents or certain neighborhoods or schools. And even if we could, it wouldn't be ethical. So it can't use random assignment and experimental methods to look at some of the most penetrating questions of human development. And that's why one of the theorists that we'll look at this semester, Urie Bronfenbrenner, talked about developmental psychology as the science of strange behaviors of children in strange situations with strange adults. Doing research within a laboratory setting doesn't necessarily hold in terms of what's going on in their naturalistic environments in the real world. So sometimes quasi-experimental designs are used to get around some of these limitations, but they have a more limited ability to draw conclusions about the population that's being studied. So this is really the gold standard, but we won't see a ton of studies that follow an experimental method. Very often, rather than experimental research, studies in human development have a correlational design to see if two variables are related. So the reading gives an example of children watching violent television and then their aggressive behaviors. So research would be done to see, to measure when children, the amount of violent television they watch and then acts of aggression, and see if there's a relationship between those two variables. A correlation exists when one variable is more or less likely to occur when the other one does. And a correlation coefficient is an index that describes the degree to which the two variables are related. If there's no relationship, it's at 0. If there's a perfect relationship where the variables always exist together, then it's 1, but most things are somewhere in between. So it's a useful study design to see if there's a relationship between two variables, and it doesn't have to involve an artificial manipulation. So you can find out what's really going on and use it, for example, do a survey and find out how often children watch violent television and ask their parents to report their aggressive behaviors. You don't have to necessarily manipulate these variables, but there are major limitations. One of the mantras of social science research is that correlation is not causation. Just because you see that there is a relationship between two variables doesn't prove that one thing causes the other. It could be that the direction first from what we think it is, so maybe more aggressive children seek out more violent television, or a third factor can be involved. So, for example, watching television and aggressive behavior may have a root cause that they share, like harsh parenting or poor parental supervision. So correlational research starts to become stronger when you get larger numbers, either through studies that have very large sample sizes or meta-analyses that look at multiple studies. And then you can start being more confident that there is a relationship between two variables, but still there's the question of directionality and the possibility of a third variable being the true cause. Another thing that researchers studying human development need to consider when they design a study is how frequently they will collect data from subjects. In a cross-sectional design, you take a group of people and study them now to see what the differences are among age groups. So that saves time because you can do all the research now, but it just gives you a snapshot of what's happening at a particular point in time. So the advantage is that it's quick and easy, but the limitation is that we can't see how people change over time. And then another limitation is that we may observe differences between different generations, people at the age of 20, 40, 60, 80, but it may have to do with what's developmentally typical for a particular age, but it may have to do with the experience of a particular generation growing up within a particular historical and cultural context. So this came up in last week's discussion around age norms and social clocks. Every generation has different age norms. They tend to change generation to generation. The ones for your generation are different from your parents. And so if we want to draw conclusions that are more universal about human development, then it's problematic to study people at just one point in time. So we study people with longitudinal designs, and that still doesn't really address that generational issue. But what it does allow for us to do is to see one group of people repeatedly over time. And so we take someone from age 20 and follow them all the way to age 80, for example, and see what happens at different points and different ages. And that is helpful in terms of knowing what differences come with different ages. But again, there may be a generational bias that's going on there because we're looking at a 20-year-old and several 20-year-olds that are part of a particular cohort in a particular generation. And so we can't generalize our findings to people of different generations. So an effort, a way of overcoming that in terms of methods is a sequential design where you actually take different cohorts of people at different ages and follow them over time. So you've got different cohorts and you're following them over time so that you can disentangle what's normal for particular ages from differences related to the generations. But you do not see that design very often. That would be very expensive and complex. What you see most frequently are cross-sectional designs that just take a snapshot at a particular point in time. And then increasingly you see longitudinal research that observes people starting at a particular age and follows them in their development over time. And I'm going to give an example of a study in just a moment. So we have an example of longitudinal research that was started right here at UOW. That's a new study. It was started with a small sample in 2014, and then the full study started in 2015, looking at, it's going to follow 1,000 children born within the Illawarra and their parents and their families at 2-year intervals to check on their health and their well-being. And the aim of the study is to gather information on the factors that lead to improved health. The strength of a study like this is that researchers can study what happens at different points of the lifespan. So this study started with pregnant women, and so it looked at prenatal development and then followed up right after in the postnatal period. And it looked at things like postnatal depression in mothers and fathers, I think. Looked at things like choices around breastfeeding. And it sounds like from the website that there's data collection through a verbal report, like asking people about their depression levels or whether they breastfeed, and then also about physiological types of measurement, like checking blood and urine for vitamin levels in the pregnant mother, and checking exposure to toxins in the mother and possibly also in the infant. So I'll put a link to the study in the optional section of the workbook so that you can read more. But the strength of a longitudinal research design is that you can look at different periods of the lifespan for the same group rather than just get a snapshot of what happens at a particular age, which would be just doing a research study with pregnant mothers and then never following them up. This way, there'll be a wave of data for these participants during pregnancy and right after birth, and then a wave of data when the children are 2, and a wave when they're 4, and a wave when they're 6, and so on. And so you can start to see, oh, well, there was an exposure, there was some exposure to toxins, let's say, prenatally, and then that maybe there's an association with children's cognitive development later, or there was a decision, this kind of parenting decision, and maybe that's associated with something down the line. So it's certainly richer than cross-sectional in terms of drawing conclusions about human development. To conclude this discussion of research design and methods, I just wanted to comment about some of the challenges of doing human development research. A lot of the research in this area on human development comes from a pretty narrow slice of humanity, people who tend to participate in research studies. So those are people who tend to live near university campuses, are very often college students, come from a European background, tend to be more affluent than the general population. So we can't necessarily presume that we can generalize to other groups. This research has probably given us a fairly biased understanding of human development. There's a lot less research that looks at people who are from developing countries, people from different cultural backgrounds, people who come from more disadvantaged groups. There is some research that's beginning to fill this gap, and in fact, here at the University of Wollongong, the Early Start Research Institute has as one of its missions to do more research on children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there's more research coming also from developing countries. But it's important for us to be conscious of the limitations of the research that we have, and also the issues with generalizing from this research to populations, to more diverse populations. So there's a need for more research that captures the more full spectrum of people's experiences. Now we're going to shift and talk about the ethics of research. So that's another challenge in human development and in social science research in general, is to ensure that research is done ethically. Ethical research is around protecting the rights of people who participate in research studies, and research ethics are standards of conduct about how researchers need to act to protect research participants from psychological or physical harm. And ethical research is important in human development and generally in the social sciences because unethical research has been done in the past. And so that's shown us that the importance of showing respect for people, ensuring that we have well-designed research that's worth its time, and protecting people's rights. So the reason that we have ethical guidelines for research is due to a history of past harms caused to people due to research being done in a way that was not ethical. So the Nuremberg Code was the first international code of research, and it emerged from the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi war crimes, in which there was an investigation of crimes that were committed against people, atrocities that were done in the name of research that involved mutilating people, injecting people with things against their will, doing things that that harmed them and ultimately killed people. And so those recommendations included voluntary informed consent, so that people have a choice to participate in a research study. They can withdraw their choice if they choose to do so. They must be informed of the purpose of the research, the benefits of the research, the risk of the research before they provide their consent to participate and agree to participate or not. People cannot be coerced to participate in research, so they shouldn't be manipulated. If there's a power relationship, it's not fair to ask people to participate if they don't feel that they can say no. And then the risks of research also should be outweighed by the humanitarian benefits of the research. So there should be more potential for good than for harm, and it really should be weighed in the favor of benefits. So we have that set of codes, and those principles are still part of ethics today. And the Helsinki Declaration added to those regulations because of continued issues around unethical research, and introduced the concept of having an oversight committee at places like universities to ensure that research was done ethically. So in Australia and here at the University of Wollongong, we have a Human Research Ethics Committee, and any research that involves human participants must be approved by the Human Research Ethics Committee. And their primary purpose is to ensure that researchers adhere to the tenets of ethical research that we'll discuss in a minute. And then the second purpose is to ensure that the research is of beneficial to the wider community. So checking to make sure that research is being done that's worth people's time and is going to benefit people. So there are several tenets of ethical research, and there are several things that we do in terms of doing ethical research that come out of these values. So the first is beneficence, the idea that research should have maximal benefits and minimal risks. So a researcher must avoid risks or reduce them as much as possible, and the priority of the researcher should be the welfare of the participants in the research. And so this is something where an ethics committee has to determine whether a research study meets this tenet. Is it likely to have a greater benefit than the risk for potential harm? And even psychological risk, so risk for discomfort, psychological discomfort is considered. And even inconvenience, actually. So if you're taking people's time, their time has value, and is it worth what you are going to be learning from the study? That's something that the committee will look at. The research merit and integrity. So this is related in that the committee will also look at, is this study worthwhile? Is it well designed? Is it high quality? Is it likely to be able to contribute in some way to new knowledge? And if not, then why are you doing it? Because again, you're putting people at a potential risk, taking their time. And then also, is there honesty in terms of the sources of funding for research, how the research is being sponsored, is there conflict of interests among the person who's doing the research? Maybe they're trying to have a particular outcome of the research. So like an example would be, if there's a drug company testing a drug and they want to be able to sell that drug for profit, there can be a motive there. So that has to be disclosed to an ethics committee so that they know that there's integrity in the research. Justice is another very important tenet of ethical research. It shouldn't be the case that the benefits of the research go to one group, such as the researchers only or people in a wealthy country, and all of the risks go to another group. So you're doing research on a disadvantaged group, such as the poor or people who are living in developing countries. So you don't want there to be an imbalance there in terms of who's going to benefit, but who's bearing the risk of the research. And justice also states that you have to be very careful in terms of vulnerable groups. So those include children, they include people who may have disability or mental incapacity, or children. And so you have to be careful to ensure that they are not being used in some way, that they are being able to consent in a way that's appropriate and not just being used. And then respect for human beings is another aspect of ethical research. So it's about valuing people's dignity and their rights to make decisions about participation. So this is where information needs to be provided to people so that they can know what the study is about, whether they want to contribute to it, have information about it, how their own information, personal information, will be used, if their name is going to be used, how their data is protected. So it's about valuing people's dignity and their rights to make decisions about whether they want to participate or not. Now I'd like to talk about these ethical guidelines and how they relate to your assessment number 4, the life story interview analysis. So that this assessment has been registered with the University of Wollongong Ethics Committee, and it had to meet the requirements that I just described around the tenets of ethical research. And so there are several things that have been put in place that you'll have to comply with in order to do the interview, the life story interview, in an ethical way. And so the first one is one of them is around informed consent. So when you choose to interview someone, you'll need to distribute the participant information sheet that is on Moodle so that that person can read about the purpose of the interview and understand how his or her information is being used. And then that person will be asked, you'll ask that person to sign a consent form. And that form has to be turned into your tutor, and I have to have a copy of it so that I have it on file for the ethics committee. That's a requirement of ethics committees, that you keep consent forms on file. Confidentiality is another aspect of ethical research, and in the study or in this assessment that you're doing, you're asked to use a pseudonym, meaning not that person's name, a made-up name, when you are interviewing the person. If you are audio recording, so refer to that person by the name you've made up. Put that name that you've made up in your notes. And then when you write it up for your paper, again, you don't use the real name of the person to respect their personal information. Then minimizing the risk of harm. So you're asked not to ask about traumatic life experiences or about criminal involvement. That's stated on the participant information sheet, and so the person that you're interviewing will see this as well. This is so that we don't go into a life experience that's upsetting to the person. That person is asked to avoid that topic to minimize the risk of psychological discomfort. And then another piece is around that this interview is voluntary. And so that's why you're being asked to interview someone who's not an immediate relative, so someone doesn't feel it's compulsory for them to participate, to help you. Also, the person that you're interviewing has the right to stop the interview and to withdraw his or her information if they choose to. And if you see that they're showing signs of distress, then please offer to stop the interview and allow the person to withdraw their information and then seek another person to interview. So by following these guidelines we will discuss in tutorial in week 2, you'll ensure that the research that you're doing around doing an interview is done in an ethical way. So that concludes the lecture 2.1 for week 2, and now we're going to move on to theories of human development in the next lecture.